Aldo Leopold stated, "One of the anomalies of modern ecology is that it is a creation of two groups, each of which seems barely aware of the existence of the other. The inevitable fusion of these two lines of thought will, perhaps, constitute the outstanding advance of the present century. The division is seen in the two separate disciplines of history and sociology in the applied sciences. Combining the narratives of each can help us understand our country's history and its outlook for the future more efficiently than if they were comprehended separately, as they have historically been seen as opposites rather than complements." It is rarely mentioned that the French sought to utilize the Ohio River Valley as its breadbasket. When you think about it ecologically, Canada possessed long, harsh winters with a small growing season, and other French territories in the south near Louisiana retained poor soils and unfavorable growing conditions for many crops. The French crown was losing money across America to feed its colonists, and with such a financial struggle on their hands, the crown saw the Ohio River Valley as the agricultural hub that would sustain the large spread French population. This meant that those living in the Ohio River Valley were reliant on indigenous populations to trade, sell, and purchase items across the settlements.
Now, of course, in Canada, French Canada, this agricultural product is not going to be it's not going to be possible. And other potential profitable crops like wheat, which became a major export of the English colonies, even that's going to be difficult in Canada because of the climate. So agriculture will not really then be the basis for a French model of profitable empire. So they're going to have to turn to really that second model that European empires discover is the route to wealth, and that is commerce, right? Broadly, what can we get that is a commercial product that can be shipped around the world? And so in New France, then the principal product that's going to support this commerce will be the fur trade.
The Native Americans of the Great Lakes satiated the hunger the colonists of New France had for economic gain and prestige. The French relied on the critical hunting skills of the indigenous populations to trade deerskins and beaver pelts, which would find their way on the global market overseas in the form of luxury items. From the European perspective, American beaver furs possessed several virtues. They represented a commodity in short supply in Europe. Because of their light weight, they offered high value relative to bulk, could be readily packed and transported, and, as a result, were highly profitable. Indians performed most of the work, including delivery of prepared furs to European settlements. By the year 1500, the European beaver was considered virtually extinct in Western Europe, and only small pockets of beaver remained in Russia and Scandinavia for commercial consumption.
Beavers are not top predators, but they're a kind of keystone species called ecosystem engineers, which means that they change the physical properties of the ecosystem. And beavers do that by building dams, damming rivers and streams, and then building a lodge in the middle of that stream. So they're literally altering the ecosystem physically. And they're cutting down trees when they do that. They're changing the route of the streams. They're changing the water levels of the streams. So you can imagine not having them is going to completely change the ecosystem.
Like the beaver, natives were changing the land for thousands of years prior to European arrival. However, after colonists landed in the New World, native groups had to learn to adapt their practices. With the introduction of French mercantilism, native cultures are disrupted as they begin to contact Europeans who capitalize on resources and native labor. Quickly, the indigenous realize that in order to obtain and maintain power in the New France region, they need to become active participants in the fur trade.
They were the people that were being, encouraged to kill more animals, to process the furs, and then to haul them out to the French settlements in exchange for trade goods. You couldn't then practically treat the native peoples that you relied upon for this trade, you couldn't treat them negatively. You couldn't cheat them as much as is so prominent in the English New World. You certainly couldn't enslave them like the Spanish did, because when you sent them then into the interior to get the furs, they wouldn't come back.
But it's also, all of these forts, it's convenient that they're along French Creek, but that would also have meant that on any given day there were likely native people passing by the fort. And so that relationship can't always have been hostile, even when it was tense.
As indigenous peoples joined the French as procurers of fur, socio-political violence between inter- and intra-tribal relations quickly rose, resulting in a 70-year war. The French infused their greed of material wealth into the indigenous systems that once thrived with little to no material goods. Cultural value shifted, consequentially harming what once was so precious to the indigenous: nature.
And you can, if you read the ethnohistory, you can see a French tension, particularly with the Five Nations Haudenosaunee. In Cartier's initial accounts, when he first sees the St. Lawrence Iroquois people in the St. Lawrence Valley, he tends to admire them, and he talks about their villages and their agriculture, and he kind of makes the St. Lawrence Valley look like a land of great bounty. And so it stands out when he comes back on his second voyage that these people aren't around anymore. He doesn't see these villages anymore.
When the French arrive very early, the French begin to seek this commercial relationship and trading with their local natives. The Huron Wendat are going to try to monopolize this trade, because they learn very quickly that whoever has direct access to these trade goods will then wield power over other natives that don't have direct access. So essentially, the Huron Wendat want other natives to bring them the furs, then they trade it to the French. They get the goods, and then they trade those back to the other native groups. This gives them power over, A, right, as middlemen, they get more profit out of this, but B, they can control the critical trade goods, which are, in some respects, domestic goods, blankets, etc. But in many other respects, these are weapons: steel axes, steel knives, and of course, firearms. And so whoever has access to this weaponry now has significant power over the other indigenous neighbors that they have.
And so there was good cause to wonder whether the ethnohistoric accounts of the time of the Beaver Wars exaggerate some of these relationships, not only between European and indigenous folks, but among the indigenous folks themselves. It was in the French best interest to describe the Haudenosaunee as lethal and bloodthirsty. It was in the British best interest to describe the Haudenosaunee as lethal and bloodthirsty. We do know that the reception of the forts along French Creek, the fort at Presque Isle, the fort at Fort LeBoeuf, we do know that there were a number of tense times when native people clearly were not happy with the presence of European folks in those places.
By competing with the native species, and then sometimes out-competing them, so replacing them on the landscape. So, and a lot of invasive species come pre-adapted to that climate and to that environment because they're from a similar part of the world, and so it's very easy for them to get established, and yet they don't often come with their natural enemies, like predators and herbivores and things like that. So they're able to just grow out of control, and the native species don't have that advantage. So they're at a big disadvantage competitively because the native species are getting hit by their normal enemies, whereas the non-native is not, and they're often able to outcompete it. And those or so the invasive species are able to outcompete the natives. And then often what happens is if they get established in a certain place, they're there, and yet all of the native species are not adapted to living on them. And so they're kind of a void of diversity.
Much like the French who found their way to the New World, they themselves became an invasive species which outcompeted and dominated the indigenous. The beavers in North America became an exploited material which nearly faced extinction at the predatory grasp of French commercialism. Since human habitation of the New World, the indigenous had learned to exploit their resources within reason. They farmed the land, hunted, and functioned within their own economy prior to contact. But because of this learned Western ideal of wealth and prestige, new rivalries and alliances rewrote the ecological future of America. As native populations significantly declined, the European materialistic values are perpetuated through westward expansion and dehumanizing acts against groups seen as subordinate. Though the land was once seen as one of want and plenty, it never truly satisfied the hunger of its exploiters. Today, this hunger is still omnipresent in the ways we think about and treat the land.